So today I'll be talking about, let's say, the institutionalization, or just to read the title again, the legalization of electoral fraud in Venezuela. And what I hope to show you through my talk, and what I hope to be able to do eventually in my paper, is trace a shift that has taken place, I argue, in the political regime in Venezuela from what was, if you go back far enough, a democracy to a competitive authoritarian regime to most recently a more sort of traditional authoritarian dictatorship. And this is a shift that I argue can be observed and traced through looking at changes that have taken place in the country's electoral body, which is called the, in its Spanish acronym, the CNE, the Consejo Nacional Electoral. And so crucially, what I'm going to argue is that in the period of time that I'm going to be talking about today, which is roughly from 2015 to 2017, there weren't any legal decisions from the Supreme Court. There was no new legislation that changed the way fundamentally that the CNE operated. But there was still a shift. And so in other words, there was no overt variable, I would argue, that we could point to and say there was a change at the CNE in this period of time because the Supreme Court made such and such decision, or because the National Assembly passed such law. And so to give you a brief overview of my talk, I'm going to begin with some preliminary questions to just give you an idea of where my thinking was when I was thinking about this issue, beginning to write this paper. Then I'll talk very briefly about the, it's doing that thing that I hate that it does, the time thing. We're going to be talking about the CNE. And then I'm going to pinpoint what I consider to be the turning point in the CNE's sort of fundamental approach to elections, which was an election in 2015. And then I'll talk about how the CNE eventually perfected, institutionalized, or legalized electoral fraud in Venezuela, and that happened last year. Then I'll go over some thoughts that I have, possibly to center my discussion on, and then I'll end with more questions. I don't really have any answers, just a lot of questions. So, okay, preliminary questions. So, the starting point for this paper for me is this question. So how can we make sense of the deployment of legal and democratic principles and institutions to carry out illegal and undemocratic acts? And here I'm influenced by Levitsky and Wey's competitive authoritarianism. So there's a book of the same name from 2010 where the authors argue that somewhere between democratic countries and authoritarian dictatorships, there's sort of a bit of a hybrid zone that they call competitive authoritarianism. And these are governments that they claim, that they argue are not entirely democratic, they're not entirely authoritarian. And one of the parameters that Levitsky and Wey identify as being characteristic of competitive authoritarian regimes is that they have elections, that there are widely, this is a quote from the book, widely viewed, that there are democratic institutions that are widely viewed as the primary means of gaining power, end quote. But even though these institutions exist, the incumbent abuses them to the end that you have elections, for example. So you have free elections, people are able to vote, you can run as a candidate, you can fundraise, etc. But the elections are not fair. They're extremely unfair. So that's what Levitsky and Wey identify as a competitive authoritarian regime. And so the second question flows from the first. So how can advocates for democratic change achieve their goals if democratic tools are co-opted for undemocratic ends? And I'll give you just a little bit of context here. So for many years now, going back probably at least a decade, the political opposition in Venezuela has worked it's disjointed, it gets all kinds of criticism for being fractured and, sort of fighting each other all the time. But if there's anything that resembles a sort of consistent message from the opposition in Venezuela over the last decade or so, is that they have positioned themselves as the democratic alternative to an authoritarian government. So the ruling party in Venezuela right now is called the PSUV, and so when you listen to opposition leaders giving speeches or when you read their documents, their press releases, they always set themselves up as the democratic options. We have two choices here: authoritarianism under the PSUV, democracy with the opposition. So what happens when you are advocating for democracy? You call yourself a Democrat, but then you cannot use democracy to gain power. So these are sort of the questions that have guided my thinking as I begin this paper. Sorry, I'm not texting anybody. I'm trying to time my presentation. It looks like I'm like checking my WhatsApp. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the CNE. So this is the central sort of electoral regulation body in Venezuela. It's what I'm tracking in my paper, what I'm looking at. And so the CNE has 5 heads. It's been around since 1999. It has 1 president, 1 vice president, and 3 rectors. Now, on paper, the CNE is impartial. The 5 heads cannot identify openly with one party or another. But what happens today, what you see today, is that 4 of the 5 heads are very actively sort of pro-government. The PSUV, again, is the ruling party. And then you have 1 who is pro-opposition. So what happens increasingly is that any time that there's an electoral sort of question before the CNE, or the CNE has to talk about anything to do with an election, you can tell which side the CNE is going to side with because of its composition. Again, it's decidedly pro-government institution. And so what does that mean in practice? Well, the CNE actively suppresses votes that are disadvantageous to the government, and it's been doing that with much more force, much more intensity, much more regularity in recent years, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so to give you an example, in 2016, there was a recall referendum effort against President Maduro. So in the Venezuelan Constitution, there is a mechanism for recalling the president. It's all very sort of clearly, as clearly as it can be in a constitution, spelled out how to do that. And so for all kinds of reasons that I can get into in the question and answer period, the recall referendum had to happen before the end of 2016, or otherwise it wouldn't work. And so the opposition mobilized very quickly in 2016, and they submitted all of the paperwork that they needed to have in to the CNE in March, because they said if we do it in March, it will take a couple months, we'll have the recall by the end of the year. What happened was that at every step of the way, the CNE built walls and obstacles and sort of, made up regulations or slightly altered regulations to make the opposition have to go back and sign more, collect more signatures, and once they had collected them, they had to collect them again in a different way, etc. And so after months of a very frustrating effort to sort of really jump through these hoops that the CNE was creating, the CNE in October of 2016 said, you know what, just forget it. We're not going to have it. There's not enough time. It's already October. It's almost the end of the year, basically. Recall referendum is off. And on the opposite side of that, the CNE also enthusiastically facilitates beneficial votes, votes that are beneficial to the government. And the most recent example of that is today's Friday. On Tuesday, the Constituent Assembly, which is sort of a pseudo-legislature in Venezuela, said we need to have presidential elections right away before April 30th. And then the CNE said, okay, let's do it. Let's go, right? Like we can get the machine going to have a presidential election within 2 months, but they couldn't organize a recall vote in 9 months. So, okay, so I'm describing sort of a really kind of dysfunctional, maybe biased, not mine, maybe clearly biased body. So what happened? How did it get to be that way? Well, it wasn't always like that, because remember, hopefully I've made it clear, otherwise I'm sorry because I'm not being clear. But under a competitive authoritarian regime, you do have elections and they're free, but they're unfair. So up until 2015, I argue Venezuela was a competitive authoritarian regime. Evidence of that is the 2015 National Assembly election. The National Assembly is a legislature in Venezuela. It had been under the control of the ruling party since Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. And in 2015, there was a really important election. The legislature, of course, is a very important body in Venezuela, as it is in Canada and other places. And it flipped from being completely under the control of the ruling party to being a supermajority for the opposition. And I have the results here. So there was 56.2% of the parliament went to the opposition, and 40.9% went to the PSUV. Again, complete reversal. And I think I call that a turning point because what that election showed was that public opinion had turned against President Maduro. So Venezuelan history, Hugo Chavez was a very popular leader. 1999, 2013, he dies. He appoints Maduro as his successor. There's a lot of enthusiasm for him initially. A lot of people are excited because they're carrying over that enthusiasm and that love that they had for President Chavez. But by 2015, people are sort of disillusioned with him when they realize, oh, this guy's not Chavez. Chavez was likable. He was always on TV with a little guitar. Like there was a parrot on his shoulder one time. He was just a likable guy. Like even people who didn't agree with him sort of politically couldn't help but like him. Maduro was not that guy. And so by 2015, the CNE says, okay, we can't do that thing about holding elections and cheating a little bit or cheating a lot. Like that's not going to work anymore. Because there were all kinds of allegations throughout the 2015 parliamentary election that the CNE was doing all kinds of tricks. Voter suppression, they would bus people around from different jurisdictions to vote. They would exchange votes for food and all that stuff. And so the message of the election to the CNE was like, that doesn't work anymore. You can't just cheat your way to victory. And so that was a sort of a wake-up call, and the flip at the CNE switched. And by 2017, we had moved from that competitive authoritarian model of elections, where elections are free but unfair, to the perfected model, the model that you might have in a country like North Korea that still has elections but nobody would argue are free. And we see that with the 2017 Constituent Assembly election. So what happened in that election was that President Maduro, because the opposition won the national election in 2015, they gained control of the legislature. The PSUV loses the legislature, they start to panic. President Maduro says, not a problem, we'll just make our own legislature. We're going to call it the Constituent Assembly. It's going to be more powerful than the National Assembly. It has legislative powers, and that's going to solve our problem, that we've lost the legislature. And so what happened in that election, and I'm happy to talk about it more later because I don't have time to, a lot of stuff happened. But leading up to, yes, thank you. Leading up to the election, the election happened in July of 2017. That was right at the end of what is arguably the most tumultuous period in President Maduro's presidency since 2013. We had months of daily protests. By the time that the election took place, 120 people had been killed in clashes with the government all around the country. And actually, on the day of the election, 15 people died in fighting with government forces because the Constituent Assembly was something that overwhelmingly public opinion polls showed Venezuelan people did not want. They saw through the ploy. They saw this is a way for you to retake the legislature and do whatever you want. We don't want that. So the CNE says, great, we had the most successful election in the history of Venezuela. Everything was fine. There's a government official who denied that people died, and at least 15 people died. And the CNE said, oh, it was so successful, actually, we had an 8 million voter turnout. And when that number came out, a lot of people, a lot of observers and government critics said that doesn't make sense because public opinion polls were showing much lower expected participation. And you could just, they couldn't maybe put it into words, but they could say, this number's fake. It doesn't make sense. Thankfully for them, they got a lot of help a couple of days later when the company that provides voting machines for elections in Venezuela, when you go vote in Venezuela, you do it on a little electronic machine. So the company that provided the machines for this Constituent Assembly election, and that had in fact been providing voting machines for many years before that, released a statement on August 2nd saying, based on the robustness of our system, we know without any doubt that the turnout of the recent election for a National Constituent Assembly was manipulated. This is the company that provided the machines. Now, I think this is an unprecedented statement. I was looking for similar statements from other companies that, were basically calling an election on a national level fake. I couldn't find any. The company was very diplomatic. They never released the official numbers, but they just said the 8 million is not what it was. And so the CNE, instead of conducting some sort of investigation or asking questions or saying, oh my goodness, how could this be? Did we make a mistake? They just got rid of the company. They accused them of being subverted by imperialist interests or whatever, and they hired an Argentinian company not long after to conduct future elections. Okay, so we've gone from having a competitive authoritarian election in 2015 where the government is cheating but the election is relatively free, to one in 2017 where the government literally made up the results. Like, it doesn't matter how many people voted, the government doesn't care. It was 8 million. That's like North Korea level election tampering and fraud, right? So some thoughts. Thinking about this, I think that the CNE had at its disposal the tools to institutionalize electoral fraud before 2017. So again, this is coming from that observation that there was no legal mandate from the legislature, from the Supreme Court, fundamentally altering the way that the CNE operates. The CNE of 2017 was essentially the same one from 2015. It had just made a decision to say, well, let's just forget about this whole election thing, let's just make up the numbers. And so I think that's an interesting idea to explore because it forces us to think about, well, if it already had the tools that it needed to falsify elections and get away with it, how can we discern the existence of these tools before they're deployed? And there I'm thinking about, although maybe not directly, Saddam Hussein's illegality, so the idea that the law sometimes recognizes that it is bound by itself, and so it sort of has to step beyond the boundaries to, in the name of justice. But I wonder if this is sort of an opposite of that in some ways, where the CNE realized that it was constrained in some ways, and it just said, well, forget about it, let's just not be constrained anymore. Like, if we're the ones who are writing the rules, let's just make up numbers. And this is my last slide. I have more questions. Are there better ways to safeguard democratic institutions to prevent their co-opting authoritarian practices? So I'm thinking here, when I tell people about Venezuela, they get this like crazed look in their eyes because when I'm explaining what's happening there, it's like seems so unbelievable, right? And you think, well, Venezuela's far away, it's like another place, and like that can happen here, right? What I'm suggesting is that maybe it could, if we're not careful. And so the second question sort of flows from that. Can we trust democracy to be able to defend itself from these types of attacks? And I'm thinking specifically about the Voter Fraud Commission that we had in the United States up until earlier this month. We had Trump, with no basis other than he's Trump and he can make up whatever he wants, saying that there was a voter fraud in the election. I'm going to have a commission investigated. And I think, that was terrifying. And we know now that the commission was asking the state of Texas to provide a list of Hispanic voters for some nefarious purpose, right? So thankfully that commission has been dissolved. But what I want to suggest is that, Venezuela is not that far away. Like, the United States was heading down, it's arguably sort of heading down in the same direction as well.